So if you've been a listener of the channel for a while, you've seen that we've changed up the format, and that change includes smaller bits during the week, and we are going to continue, however, with having these interviews and having these conversations because we, as gun culture, are in that state of looking for community, and somebody who's come across my radar for having that ability is our guest today. So would you introduce yourself?
Hi. Hey, first of all, thank you for having me on. My name's Angel Cortes, and to keep it short, I'm a former Army Ranger. I've been out for a while now, and living in Southern California.
So there has to be a certain amount of nepotism going on because I think I keep inviting Rangers onto the show, hoping that we'll all like have the exact same mentality, and it's never the same. But welcome back on. So you're back out in California. For those of that are listening that are newer to your story, could you do a quick, too long didn't read summary of it?
Yeah. I'm a recently I'm a kidney donor. I work in for Defense Strategies Group, which is a tactical consulting security company. Uh, I went to school to become a registered dietitian. I was two classes away from finishing my program, and then just decided to go full time on Defense Strategies Group because business was picking up. Um, and before that, I was an Army Ranger. I went to Iraq and Afghanistan. Saw a bunch of combat. To the point where we made national headlines 3 times. The people who were around me have now written books, done TED Talks, been on Fox and stuff like that. And before that, I was a gang member. And before that, I was just some poor, malnourished, first generation born kid trying to survive.
I want to start with I wanted to start on common grounds with Ranger Battalion. What years were or what was that timeline? Because I'm about 10 years out of getting out of the military now.
So I was in from '08 to 16, but I didn't get to a regiment until 2013.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So you would have entered in regiment right around the time I was leaving.
Oh, okay.
Yep. And so because I got into the military in '08 as well. I'm assuming we're probably similar in
Oh,
age.
yeah.
But that's good to hear. But so that's neat. I think we're gonna have room to get into the Ranger Battalion section earlier. But the one of the big questions that's been kind of boiling on my mind, and I've been looking forward to having with you, is that I come from when I entered into Ranger Battalion, I came from what could be considered something like a sheltered home. I grew up in rural Minnesota to married parents who, for lack of better words, lived a generally peaceful, quiet life. And then in the Midwest is very, what would you call it? Risk averse in some ways, or it's conflict avoidant. So you take a young Christian conflict avoidant kid from rural Minnesota and you thrust him into Ranger Battalion, and that is such a huge culture shift.
Oh, I can imagine.
Yeah, so that's my experience, right? And one of the things that looked at how that approached Ranger Battalion was when I got into Battalion and while I was there for a while, it seemed like us at the private level were trying to stack who had the harder childhood, whose childhood was more difficult and had to overcome more adversity in their youth. And so like I was the odd man out because I had adversity for sure, but it wasn't like stereotypical. Did you encounter anything like that in the military at all?
Not really, because we would talk about our upbringing and stuff like that, but it was never a measuring contest of whose was worse. It was just more than anything, just us sharing, and then to pass the time, because sometimes you are just waiting for this or waiting for that, and you pass the time, and next you hear something that was very foreign. Like for example, when one of my buddies was like, "Hey man, I went to college. I had people said I was going to go pro at the NFL, but he tore something. I think he blew out his entire knee, and then he went from the promised kid to, hey man, that NFL career isn't looking that like it's going to happen. So, and before that, he was he would say a God fearing Christian, and his parents were together and never fought. So, I would ask him questions, and then he would ask me questions, because obviously our upbringings were completely different, but it was never a measuring contest. If anything, when you just hear people, you can hear that they themselves have not necessarily maybe struggled with lack of food or guidance or love, but more like, hey, like my friend was in the NFL, man, like, or not NFL, he was working towards the NFL. So obviously, as a child, and then in high school and in college, you're being tested on the field, off the field. So that's just a different type of physical, mental challenges.
So when you say it like that about how you had a more of a sense of getting to know one another, I can find myself as a little jealous, and I'm wondering if you, how do I say this? I kind of see that transition, that mentality being approached to now what we call gun culture. Is that,
Mm-hmm.
gun culture is very influenced by the military, but there was this sense of, even in Battalion, my experience had a lot to do with sort of picking and choosing who was in the elite category or the cool guy, or whatever we wanted to call it, based on some sort of childhood challenges. And now what people talk about occasionally outside of the military is this idea of gatekeeping, and it's the gun culture world of, well, I have this experience, so now I get to talk about this, but you don't. How does that, have you seen that concept applied in different areas of your life, or is that seem do you,
Um, well, I have seen it. I've seen it in the military. Obviously, when you haven't deployed, or then when I did deploy, I remember some of the older guys saying, "Hey, this deployment wasn't, shit compared to this deployment, that deployment." And I've also seen it in the gun culture. Obviously, I'm more now in the gun community, right? I'm not in the military. Um, and I have seen some guys be like, "Hey, you can't talk about this because you haven't done it," or so and so. But it's been on my mind lately is that within the gun community, it goes both ways. Even for people who haven't been in actual gunfights, there are people who have spent hours and hours doing certain drills, or getting to know every version and modification and of every weapon and every gun, and then they themselves applying that to, well, if you don't know what gen this magazine was or what gen this scope is, and you can't do a quick draw under whatever seconds, then you don't know anything. Um, which is funny, because what are we doing? Are we training? Are we training to hit steel, or are we training for combat? Because if we're training for combat, um, if some gun dude who for whatever reason has not been in an actual gunfight can do a draw in, let's say, less than half a second, right? But a dude who's been in combat, um, can't do it that fast. Like, why are they acting like somehow they don't know what they're talking about? Like they don't have the experience or say.
I've tried to describe it in the past as not having a distinct hierarchy. There is, I like the gun culture, it does not have a distinct hierarchy. We don't have a rank structure. We don't have solid lines for who's inside and outside of the community. And so as a result, you see these kinds of conversations, these kinds of like almost like infighting pop up from time to time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so it's like but it is the same thing. I appreciate that you brought it up on how the guy who's talking about sub-second draws and all this kind of detail is in the same camp, is doing the same thing that the veteran is doing, who's saying, well, I did this, I deployed, I went to combat, so I have something. And on the one hand, it looks like a kind of a jockeying for, what do you call it, supremacy, or like clout or position. And on the other hand, I think it's people just trying to be heard and recognize that they're trying to bring something to the table.
I completely agree, and I've always seen it as I can learn from both. So, me working for DSG, and some of our students are competitive shooters, and we'll talk, and they actually want to learn and hear our thoughts on certain things, and there's certain, um, not necessarily tricks, but things that they do that are very helpful and can actually make you a better shooter. But there are some things that are just not practical in an actual gunfight. So I've always been the guy to let me take what works for me, as opposed to, oh, because you said something wrong or you did something wrong, I'm going to completely dismiss everything that you're saying and doing. I've never been that type of guy. But I do agree is, there's some flexing going on. There's some, hey, I'm better. They're trying to figure out I'm better than you, or whatever. But there's also good people just trying to learn. And I think the people that are just trying to learn are the ones that are not really being heard. And it's more everyone that you hear is the negativity, because unfortunately that's what kind of runs social media and likes and views.
Yeah, the largest video or the most successful video that I've published on Instagram by what 5 to 10 fold, and which is a decent amount, right? So like if a video, oh no, sorry, by 50 times, was one where I was kind of correcting a mistake that two people were doing in a training experience, and it was they were from my perspective, they were clearly coming from like airsoft experience to trying to do something with room clearing and a CQB and a door entry. And it wasn't. It was interesting too because my criticism of it wasn't very heavy. It wasn't very heavy handed, but it was pretty straightforward. It's like, well, you can see that there's an obvious training scar here because what they're doing is they're using the door frame of the building as if it was cover. And what we were experienced in the past is that bullets travel through walls. So they're using it as cover, kind of peeking in and out, which makes sense if you're shooting BBs or even simunition at each other. That's not going to go through the wall. But if we have to do with like real guns and real ballistics, once you've given your position on the outside of the doorway, you can't stay there. You can't just stay there and wait for people to not shoot you through the wall. So bringing that up on social media was extremely productive, let's call it. Caught a lot of views all of a sudden. Whereas other different kinds of content doesn't perform as well. And it's just been an interesting experience observing that, because like it's true, but you don't want it to be true.
100%. And I've always been try to be a positive guy. Like, you have to be a positive guy. You can't be successful and make it out of the childhood that I had, and others I've had, without being positive. You just can't. Okay. So when I'm trying to do what I'm doing over here, building a community, helping out, I try to be as positive. I try to spread the message, and I've been on big podcasts spreading the good message. And, it gets views, it gets likes, but, when people are arguing about something, it gets, just like your example, like 50 times fold of views and likes. And so I have been noticing, I've tried to ignore it, but I've finally accepted the fact that, like, hey, that is what drives social media, but I refuse to jump in that pool.
The alternative, and I think this is where it comes out, is has a lot to do with demeanor. And if people are gonna build criticism into their platform, which looks like the algorithm and social, let's just call it the human algorithm desires, then what we've come to realize is that you can be critical and not be a tool about it.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
I think that's a consistency. I've seen small elements and minority elements of the gun community, the gun culture, build their identity on dragging, and it's kind of odd. It's a really weird thing to place your identity in. Is all you're doing is pissing off people or holding everybody accountable. It's like, and I can hold somebody accountable if I have a relationship with them. If I don't know you, it's just criticism.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting bout. So let's go into that. I know you've talked about your background a couple times on a couple of other shows, and so I don't want to steal your thunder because I've been able to listen to a little bit and get somewhat of an essay on who you are, but I don't know you yet. So one question that's been burning on my mind is, you go from in your youth, how did you get involved in that community, the what you considered being a gang member, and then how did they look at violence, and then how did you change your opinion when you got into Ranger Battalion, if at all?
Yeah. So, man, I grew up from first generation born, right? My parents didn't graduate college or high school. They didn't speak Spanish, but they've worked hard. They by 5 a.m. they were out of the house, and they wouldn't come back till like 6 p.m. You know, so they work long hours, but not a lot of pay. And when you're poor in a low income community, and you're living in a low income community, well, there's things that come along with those communities, and that's drugs, violence, and what comes with that is, well, either you can call it gangs or you can call it organized crime, whatever you want to call it. But the point is, they're there. They go hand in hand. Um, and I grew up a skater. I've always liked skating. I first started skating because I would borrow my cousin's skateboards. You know, like they were well off. Like they were really more well off than we were. My portion of the family, right? And I would borrow their skateboard, and eventually I made a friend who gave me, his old board, and I would just skate. But the thing is, in those communities, once you hit around a certain age, you're not a child anymore. Now you're about to be a teenager, and now you're not invisible to these gang members. Now it's like, hey, who do you run with? Who do you roll with? And I try to stay out of it as much as possible. But there was one incident that kind of like basically broke the camel's back, and that's when one day after school in junior high, in eighth grade, they stole one of my friend's skateboard, and they didn't want to give it back. And it made me very upset, and I wanted to do something about it, and they were just basically laughing at us. But I knew I couldn't do anything because my group, they were good people, but they just weren't fighters. They, for lack of better words, and these obviously are terms that I would use back then, not necessarily now, but they were pussies. And they weren't going to do anything about it. And that's when I decided, okay, what clearly I'm going to be messed with, and I can do something about it, or I can, for the rest of my life, whenever they want to punk me, and they can do and say whatever they want. So I was like, you know what? I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be stepped over. I want to just defend my own, right? And so I met a group that sooner or later, they were like, hey, man, we don't like these guys. And I was like, hey, I don't like them either. So I started hanging out with them. And then next thing you know, the question came up is like, hey, man, do you want to, join the gang? And by then I'd already been hanging around for a while. And the funny thing is that I would always bring my skateboard, and they would be like, dude, you got to stop bringing your skateboard. You're making us not look tough. And, but I was like, bro, I skate. That's what I do. That's my thing. And next thing you know, man, I joined the gang. But the thing is, I just wanted to have backup from these people so they wouldn't bug me. But what I didn't fully understand at the time, is that when I joined the gang, not only would I have backup from them from this other gang, but now whatever the gang's problems were, they were my problems. So now all of a sudden I had beef with other gangs that I never heard of, that I never knew, with people that I never knew from other schools. And in some instances, I now became enemies with kids I grew up with. Like, for example, I went to 3 different junior highs. So I made a lot of friends, and I met a lot of people in these junior highs. And all of a sudden, when we would see each other at a, let's say, high school party, the way when I would see them, I'm like, oh, yeah, dude, I remember you. What's up, man? And they were not having it. It was like a big, no, fuck you, dude. And, you're my enemy. And it was strange to me. And I'm like, bro, we like hung out together in junior high. I just moved. So then I went to a different junior high, and all of a sudden you hate me. And it's moments like those where I would come to realize, like, damn, this is not what I thought it was going to be. But, then add testosterone, add peer pressure, add the fact that, I was physically, mentally abused growing up, and there's anger, and there's all this and that, and it's a big ball of emotion. And I was angry. So, I did get lost in the world, and the deeper and deeper I went. But sooner or later, I had to admit to myself, not only within, but outside, and verbalize, like, hey, I fucked up, and this is not what I should have been doing. And by then I'd already had a crew within the gang that I controlled. And I told them, like, hey, man, we got to get out. This is not the way. We can still hustle. We can make money. We can go party. I'm not saying we're going to be punks and get stepped on, but we just don't have to be in a gang.
I am glad that you're able to tell the story, because for my even my own position and my own history, it's it's been a world that's been difficult for me to understand in some cases. I'm not entirely, like, it's been difficult to understand from maybe the outside looking in, but I wanted to, but the how people get there is not a surprise. I mean, you have all the conditions that are supporting it, and I grew up in an environment very different. So I read a book a couple of years ago, yeah, a couple of years ago, called Violence of Mind, and I can't. The character who wrote it might be a little controversial, but he spent a lot of time in this book talking about how the that most people approach the concept of violence with the wrong mentality, and they think of it as some sort of, like, almost like a duel or a battle. But and his experience was supposed to be within, or as he says, his story had to do with, like, street violence and extreme close personal violence in that environment, where people were committed to killing in a way, whether it was inside the prison or in the streets. And that's a common theme that we see in gun culture, is this, well, hey, you don't really know what violence is like mentality. And the other side of the coin, from my experience, is that I was in Minneapolis during the 2020 riots. I lived in Minneapolis in 2020, 2021, and I spent a lot of time in the streets observing what was going on and documenting bits and pieces of it. And one of the things that I encountered a number of times is that when law and order broke down in Minneapolis, which isn't really a surprise given the lack of foundation that the amount of years they've been spending chipping away at their foundation, both culturally and legally. There was a massively increased gang activity, and that continues to this day, whether it's carjackings, whether it's people being held up in gunpoint, whether it's there's just a whole litany of issues, right? But and every once in a while I would encounter the youth that were involved in these gangs, and in various groups you'd find a kid who probably was 14 years old, and if you looked into his eyes, there was nothing left of him but hatred. And for where I stood, it was a common. It was like I felt like I was standing on the razor's edge between compassion and, like, it wasn't compassion. I felt bad for the kid, but I did not see there any way out for him. He didn't have any way out of his rage. And it wasn't the rage of, like, a toddler or a 5-year-old who just can't control his temper. It was this young teenage mentality, and you can see it in somebody's eyes. And you said you went to Iraq and Afghanistan, and you've been in a number of combative situations. I don't know how up close and personally you got in certain situations, but I saw some of the similar things in people in Afghanistan, where it's like, that dude is just anger. That dude is just malice. And you have to develop that kind of discernment in order to survive those ambiguous environments. And people who didn't were stereotypically washing out of both the military and what we were seeing in Minneapolis. And so my question to you is, do you have any insight for those of us who come from my background, where I don't have the gang activity? Because I joined the Army, I joined the Army, especially Ranger Battalion, because I was part of those good people but not fighters in rural Minnesota. That it was just, oh, these people are all good people, but none of them are fighters. And so I decided to go become a fighter, and instead of joining a gang, I joined the military. But I still wanted to hear from if you had something that could help explain that 15-year-old kid who was just rage. There was there's nothing left to him but anger and malice.
Well, I mean, I was that kid. So to say that there's nothing, no, there is. And to say that it's he can't get out. There's no way out. Well, there is a way out, but the thing is, the odds are not in his favor at all. So, is there something left in him for that particular kid? I don't know, but I know from me being in that situation, from being and seeing other kids in that situation, they don't want to be in that situation. But they're so stuck in there that that's all they have. That's their world. And to tell them otherwise is no different than watching a Disneyland movie. That's just fantasy. And then there are kids that I've met that I knew, bro, no matter what resources were given your way, no matter how much people talk to you, no matter what was given to you, there's something wrong with you. You thrive in this environment because this is you. This is not necessarily. It's in the almost in the category of a serial killer, right? You just can't change them. Or some pedophile, like, yo, dude, obviously you're broken because there's something in you that just wants to bang little kids. A serial killer, you just keep killing women, or you keep killing adult males, whatever it is. There's something wrong with you. And I would see some gang members that I'm like, bro, there's something wrong with you. Like there, and this that, and those are those type of people that I knew. Like, hey, man, you and I are not the same. I've spent enough time around you. I've heard you speak. No, man, we are not the same. And it's kind of shameful for me to be around you and to be considered the same thing, because I know we're not. And a small example would be, I know this dude was selling drugs. He had money, and he would call Pizza Hut to get some pizzas delivered to him, and then him and other dudes would just beat up the delivery guy and take the pizza. And I'm like, looking at it, like, bro, you have pockets full of cash. Like, what was that purpose for? Like, what did that serve? But your own mental addiction to violence, or to express something that's going on in you. Maybe you were fucked with as a kid in a certain way that just broke you, or you're just not fixable at all. But so there's that side. And then there's people like me that, you heard that bit part, and I can go in deeper detail, but I won't, of what led me to this. And when I got out, I decided to get out. Like I said, I controlled the crew, and I told my crew, like, guys, we are fucking leaving this. And I made everybody go back to school, and the ones who couldn't or weren't allowed to go back or welcome back at school, I made them enter continuation school. I made everyone else get a job. Yeah, most of us were still selling drugs, but, like, for example, I had a full-time job and I still sold drugs. And then eventually I got to a point where I didn't have to, and some of us from that group, a good chunk of us, made it out. So was it easy? Hell no. Was it tough? Yeah. And I still talk to some of the guys every now and then and be like, damn, dude, those were some crazy times. Like, we were fucking lost. We were in the thick of it. We got lucky that we didn't die, because we've had friends die. We've had friends go to jail for a very, very long time, and they're still in prison to this day, federal prison. So, and the violence part, right? We address the part of whether they can be out or not out or get out. Yeah. But then the violence part, violence in the gang world was in some ways similar to war, and some ways just different. Like, for example, when I got stabbed on the head and in my back, obviously that's up and close. That's personal. And the guy was trying to kill me, and I had just turned 15 2 days prior. And then, being shot at, and then, being jumped, and having friends get killed, like, and obviously us doing things back. And that was different because it's a lot up close and personal. And there's a certain feel to it. So when I hear people in the gun community practice knife fighting, or practice shooting, and they're like really up close, for, like, let's say a very common drills, they'll have like that dummy or just a silhouette, and they're like up close and they protect their head and they start shooting. Well, I've done that in real life. And that's when or the knife fighting, and I see people do a lot of the knife fighting. I'm not saying don't do the knife fighting training or do the up close and training, but what I'm saying is, when I hear people talk of how easy it is, or what they would do, man, it is not like that. Okay, a perfect example is like professional fighters in the UFC train pad work. They train and they do crisp drills, but then in the real fight, sometimes it doesn't even look like that, right? So, and I use that example because I think now more than ever, more people do martial arts, martial arts, and a lot of people do multiple martial arts. So I think people can get that example. Um, but in a lot of ways, it's very similar. You're in a broader way. You're protecting your own, right? I was protecting myself. I was protecting my friends. So overseas, it was the exact same thing. I kind of sometimes joke like, man, the things that I would have gotten in trouble if I got caught for it and probably been arrested for and been in jail for double digits or my entire life, I'm now getting medals and ribbons.
So
And
let's break this in half. I think let's break this into two parts.
okay,
One of them being let's call it the application of violence.
hmm,
In relation to that gang, we'll call it the gang world, and being a ranger. And the application, we'll do it skills, tactics, whatever, right? So whether it's skills, tactics, and then the bridge between the two is going to be mindset, because the other side I want to look at is how did they think about it in regards to one another. Honor culture versus dignity culture, motivations and justifications that people made for use of force or use of violence. And because I'm picking up on both of them, and I think both of them need to be separated so that we are very clear on it.
okay,
Does that make sense? Am I
yeah, yeah, yeah.
derailing you?
No, well,
So we'll let's do this application, right? You're saying there's these things you're doing in Ranger Battalion that if you did those in the stateside, you'd go to jail for. Yeah, and that's called sanction. The government sanctions the government, by the will of the people, sanctions you to go out and do violence. Give me an explanation. Give some examples of those. Maybe on how they would look in both ways between overseas and back home, and how that looked.
well, just in a broader form is right. You're bad guys, right? I try to do as much good, and people. It's hard for people to understand that aren't within. Because in my experience, people they hear my story or they start hearing me or things about me, and they don't know what category to put me in, or they put me in a certain category right away. For example, I appreciate you wanting to talk about as an insider and wanting to learn, but let's face it, you and I both know people that as soon as they hear that I was a gang member, they want to discredit everything I'll say. They don't want to listen to me. They don't want to learn from me. They don't care, and they put me in this category that they've had me or people like me in this box, and I'm going to be in there forever. And then there's people that are kind of lost. So, but they want to hear, and they have conflicting
Yeah. Well, I
thoughts.
mean, I do have kind of a short answer for that one. Is the people who fit in that first category are irrelevant. I don't see them as bearing consistent relevancy even in our community. If you're going to be constantly hung up on short things like that, that is not a sign of a deficiency in the gun culture. It's a sign of a deficiency in your, I'm not going to say powers of observation, but ability to make evaluations regarding people and their story.
Yeah,
And there's a certain stereotype that comes up in that environment, is that you bring something up, you're in a conversation with somebody, or you enter into a conversation with somebody, you're like, hey, did you hear about this event? And the first thing that they say is it's a psyop, or it was fake. Everything is fake. Everything is fake. No one is who they say they are. And this is the nihilist, the cynic, the person who's been completely consumed by this mindset, this almost worldview consuming mindset of nothing is real. And not to be even too critical, it's just your relevancy is expired.
yeah.
That's what
And,
that means to me.
and the reason why I say that is that even though I was in a gang, I tried to only do certain things to certain people. Like for example, when we would rob, I would rob drug dealers, right? I would rob dudes who for many years growing up, I would see them abuse the community. I would see them not have any heart, steal from good people. and now I was in a position to do something. So I tried to do all my bad stuff, violence towards other bad guys, right? Were they the Taliban? No. Were they Al Qaeda? No. But these were people that were basically leeches of the community. People that just it bummed me out to be like, yo, man, I can't believe you're representing my community. You're representing my race. You're representing all this and that, and obviously some people might be like, bro, but you were in it. Well, yeah. Well, listen to why I was in. So the way I would see it is I'm doing this stuff to bad people, but then I joined the military, and now I'm doing it to different bad people.
Yeah, so let's go back to applications. When I was tracking a small kind of youth-led gang in Minneapolis,
Yeah,
and whether or not they were affiliated with the Bloods is sort of it's a little bit less relevant. But who they were is they seem to be sort of the offwash from increased gang activity in a certain part. And the average ages were somewhere between 10, 11, 12ish at the youngest, and then right around that 15, 16, 17 age. um, they still had legitimacy because they still had protection under the law, but then of course 18, now you're in an entirely different category. At least that's how that's how it looks like from the outside in. But the kinds of activities that the kinds of violence that they engaged in were very much so stabbings. Like one of
yeah,
them, one of the gang leaders got stabbed to death pretty quickly, and everyone kind of knew that was going to happen because he kind of didn't really have a good essay on his environment. He didn't really know the he just didn't have a very good concept of area of operations, which is fine. That's what you're expecting out of a 17-year-old. But then
yeah,
you saw a lot of kids running around with fully automatic handguns, and they couldn't shoot and they couldn't hit. But there was always this like shock factor, almost James Bond-esque assassination attempts, and most of them were pretty failed because they're kids, right? Um, there wasn't anything like organized night raids and activities like that. How did you see the use of force change between Ranger Battalion and the street?
well, obviously more calculated, trained and stuff like that. Obviously different level, like a clear day and night level. It's organized, and I mean, come on, these are special operation guys, and then compared to you know
I think I can clarify my question. Was there a point in your time in your history when you were younger where you saw your mind realize there was so much more to this, right? So like almost like in the sense of a video game or a story that evolves and gets bigger over time. Like you're involved in street level violence and you think these things are capable and this is what being good at it looks like, and then all of a sudden you realize there's an entire world outside there, outside your perspective, that is just so much higher in skill and ability and performance. What was there any transition like that?
I mean,
Or
oh yeah, I mean, 9/11. I mean, I I watched. We didn't have cable or anything in my house, but when I would go to my friend's house, I was always watching the military channel. I was always watching the National Geographic specials on Green Berets or Rangers or Surviving the Cut on Discovery Channel. I was watching all that stuff, so I always knew, hey, there's levels to this.
okay, and then is what about the inversion of that, where someone gets, let's just use a caricature of myself who gets so ingrained into the military style of violence with operations and op orders and warnos and whatever forward operating posts and all this kind of material, and then they go out into the city and they have no, they're completely a stranger in a strange world at this point in time.
Yeah. I've noticed that. I've seen it with my friends. Like, for example, let's just say we're out on the night. Um, and obviously for years of watching my back and trying and being more observant on a street level, I would see instances where I was just like, man, my friends are they're killers, right? They're on the field and the ranges. They are. masters of their environment. But right here in the civilian world, fuck, they don't have that grade of SA, and they're kind of just vulnerable. A perfect example is there was a kind of small argument at a bar, and I always knew, and because it's happened to me, and I've done it to people, is that when there is a conflict, and if you're smart at what you do, you don't all bunch up in front of the problem. You start moving to the left and to the right, basically like flanking, and even sometimes all the way from behind. And I remember my buddy was arguing with this guy because the guy bumped into my friend, and I immediately started not looking behind that guy of who his buddies were, but to the left and to the right and behind my buddy. And I observed who it was one of the other guy's friends already had a bottle in his hand, and he was already looking to his left and his right, and then he saw me right next to him, and so then I looked at him and I shook my head, no, because I had a bottle in my hand. So I can tell that his face changed from I got the upper hand on this guy right here who's arguing to my buddy to oh fuck, one of his guys is looking at me and he's got a bottle. And I wasn't gonna smash it on the dude's head, but I just happened to have a bottle in my hand because I was drinking, and then to show him like no, let them just talk, let it play out, right? And then other cases of man, you name it, man. So when I see not stories, like companies training of how to act in the civilian world and things to do and things not to do, I always kind of just sometimes laugh because I'm like, bro, that was like my upbringing, and now people are paying hundreds of dollars to learn it in an 8-hour span on the weekend.
Yeah. So are we going to get a special training, like an instructor rise into stardom for his how to be a gunfighter in the streets mentality?
There's some people doing it out there, and some of the stuff is pretty good, but some of the stuff, based off my real world experience, I'm just like that's theory, which is nothing wrong with trying to solve a problem, because other way, how else are you going to get real world experience? You would have to put yourself in those situations, and obviously the overall goal is to not be in those situations. But some of the stuff that I see out there is just like, man, I'm not talking shit. I'm just saying, based on my experience, that is not how things go.
Yeah, and although I think some people might call that gatekeeping, we have to be kind of particular on that one.
Yeah, but there's a difference between gatekeeping and then me trying to say like, hey, it's not gonna go, and to know and understand that I'm not a gatekeeper. I've always liked to listen and learn from everybody and anybody, and it's no different than martial arts, man. There's some stuff that works, but there's also some. I think we've all seen it of crazy videos with death touch points and quick fancy something, and you're like, bro, I'm not gatekeeping martial arts. I'm just saying that doesn't work.
That's not real life. We're not everybody is Steven Seagal, right? It's not, you just can't, voodoo magic your way out of a situation. I thought it was really interesting that you made this comment on how the training is around what to do in a situation when the goal is to never be in that situation.
Yeah.
And it has it's a heavy, like, it has to do with what is your objective in life and what are your goals. And I think of something that comes down to this idea of violence, especially cultural and experiential, is how we think about cultures as well, because there's a difference between a dignity culture and an honor culture. And gang mentality in the military are very much so an honor culture, and the rest of and current contemporary America is mostly a dignity culture. Are you familiar with the distinction between these two?
Yeah, I understand what you're trying to say, but what part do you want to talk about first?
Well, I wanted to bring it up too because I've been in my studies on the more academic side. There's been a consistency in the things that people use or explain as their motivations for joining different groups, whether it's military, gangs, whether those gangs range from motorcycle gangs to just different, like even youth groups, or not youth groups, but like men's groups at churches. There's this kind of desire for brotherhood and being accountable to somebody and having some sense of community building, and then there's this like, so these calls that people are looking for are very natural, but
Yeah.
how we, so that part makes a lot of sense to me. There's a book that's worth reading called Why Honor Matters by Sommers that helps illustrate the differences between the two, and how, while we may draw a distinction between the two of them, they can be merged in some sense. And honor can be seen as a way of giving somebody a sense of purpose or meaning or position or tangibility within their community. So I was intending to, use that as a segue to get into how we think about violence from the perspective of an individual in the realm of morality and capability between different environments. And I actually don't know if it's sticking anymore.
Well, violence, I think there's a fine line to where I think we would all agree is necessary and okay, but then therefore we don't see it as violence, and in the way that people see it, like, oh, he's a violent criminal or he's a violent gang member. Perfect example is, I in college, I liked history so much that I asked my counselor if my electives can just be different history classes, and they're like, okay, I mean, if you want to, you can take another history class, that's fine. And one of the things that I come to realize is that violence has always been a part of humanity, right? And in good ways and bad ways. And I think a perfect good way that we can all agree, especially if you're American, is like World War II and going to fight the Nazis and all that, right? And then maybe even further back, like let's just say the tribes, and there was like let's just say a wild mountain lion or bear or something, and you would use violence to attack this issue and you protect the tribe, and that was seen as a great thing, right? You were a protector. But then once you get into the gang life, it gets iffy, because if you're protecting yourselves against other gang members, and then you start robbing people, and then you start fighting and spilling and destroying your community, then that obviously that's bad. That's not good. So there's a fine line, and where that line is, I think is determined up to each individual, right? I think service is a good thing, but obviously some people might see service as you're a baby killer, or you're disrupting other people that should just be left alone. Yeah.
So I appreciate that you study history. I minored in history when I went to school. So my focus was on the Napoleonic Wars, and Napoleon particularly in his fusion of politics during the French Revolution and after, as well as his idea as a general. And something that I've found difficult in my community, not my community, no, something that I found difficult as a child was growing up in the church. You saw a lot of references to King David fighting Goliath. I wasn't Catholic, but there's Saint Michael. There's this like kind of imagery, right? And then in the section that I was living in at the time, movies like Braveheart, Gladiator, Lord of the Rings were just the big movies. They were the big movies of like young men, and yet how the church approached the idea of violence was very whimsical. It's probably the way I have to describe it. Like, oh, it's so heroic over there, but I don't want to see it. I don't have any touching on it. And so going into the military, you come from Midwestern America, and stereotypically they're like, oh, thank you for your service. This is a great deal. You're serving the country. It's great. And then you come home and no one knows how to handle it, and they don't understand. They don't know how to think about it. And you don't hold that against them because you've matured a little bit. You realize they can't explain certain things to everybody. But that I think that there is this yearning in men particular to be capable and understand violence for some reason other than just to go wield it. But maybe that is to restrain it, to learn how to discipline it, to be capable but protective. And that part I don't think gets talked about enough
Uh,
because
100%. And I don't think there's something wrong with it. I think most of us, even though we have skyscrapers and we have Bluetooth and Grubhub and 3D movies, at the end of the day, humanity, men, even women too, but men want to know if they're protectors or they want to be protectors, right? We're not protecting against the mountain lion that's attacking the tribe or some invaders or something, but we want to know that we're capable of doing that. And some of us even go so much out as to join to know or be those things. Because I've gone, when you talk to other service members, they're like, hey, to be honest, I'm not that patriotic. I don't hate the country, but I I wanted to go fight. I wanted to go see that I do have the warrior spirit, that I am capable of this, that I am a protector. I'm just doing this. I'm not trying to do 20, 30 years in the military. I just want to go and fight. And I don't think there's something wrong with that. And I think, and I feel like that's not spoken as much. Like, for example, I'm patriotic as fuck. One of the big reasons why I joined the military was because my family and I were born and raised off food stamps, off state and federal programs. So when I saw that the country that has helped my family and I so much is now in trouble, the way I saw it, a big part of it was like, hey, man, now it's my chance to help the country that's been helping my family. So that's a part, but that's not the whole part. Another part why I joined was because, to be honest, I just wanted to go fight. There was this thing in me that wanted to know that, hey, you are a warrior, you are a protector, you have what it takes. And I feel a lot of people have that. Not everybody obviously can join at the perfect time and be attached to or in the best unit to get this example. Like, I know service members who it wasn't their fault, but they just didn't get what they were trying to get out of their deployments. And then there's civilians out here and cops. I've met cops who are like, yo, man, I've never been in a gunfight. Like, I been in for like 10 years and I've never been in a gunfight. And it's not their fault, but they're doing these things to kind of test themselves to see, like, hey, man, I'm going to go be a cop. Do I have what it takes to be a protector, to be a gunfighter, to be a whatever? And I don't think there's something wrong with that. But on that same topic, man, when you start doing those things, there's things that come with it. And both need to be addressed.
so you got your CIB, right?
Well, because I was a combat engineer, so it's a CAB.
CAB, okay. Okay, that interesting. Okay, so when I got into a gunfight, my first gunfight as a ranger, I was an infantry guy. Very, very, very stereotypical Ranger Battalion guy, right? Um, when I got into my first gunfight, it wasn't a very mysterious thing to me because I had listened to the stories of my grandfather for a long time, and I had listened to a lot of these things, and like it, there was a distinct tone of, okay, this is happening now. Now we're in it, but and it was novel. It was novel for the first time. Like, this was a very, very distinct novel feeling, but it wasn't like soul shatteringly, mind blowingly different. It was just the world got quiet and all of the ancillary things, all the little details, all my schizophrenia. I'm not schizophrenic, but I'm being sarcastic here. Everything just kind of went away, and then we knew what we had to do. And so for me, that was my experience with violence in the military. But that was my first time experiencing anything more than a scuffle in the schoolyard, a fight at summer camp, or something with pads. And that was the first like life or death legitimate violent encounter, and it was a night raid, and it was not a very long gunfight. And then there were more that happened after that. So for you, how was it different? When you got your CAB, when you were involved, how was it different?
To be honest, it wasn't that different at all, because you have to understand that not only have I been in a fight, but not even like fight where you just throw punches. I've been in brawls where dudes end up at the hospital. I've been stabbed. I've been shot at. So that it wasn't like, oh shit, like, oh, this is happening. It was a familiar feeling. The only thing is that I knew You know what? Now it's not pistols and occasionally rifles. Now it's RPGs and machine guns and dushkas and IEDs. So the bar was raised on your firearms, right? But the actual overall feeling, no.
Did
And
you have did you have an opportunity to observe your fellow Rangers?
yeah, and so to be correct, my most active deployment was when I got attached to the third group doing the whole village stability operations. Um, so I got to be fortunate or unfortunate. It does really depend on how you see it, right? But I feel fortunate to be attached to three different teams, right? Three different teams for most of their deployments. And it was an eye opening, right? Because uh, I would see I would not just infantrymen, but Green Berets also that it was their first time, and I can tell, and I would see it, and I would observe it, and some of them took it very well, but some of them it's one thing to train for it, to think about it, to see videos, to hear stories, but it's another thing to do it, and that's something that people won't understand until they're put in it, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
can see some of them took it like, fuck, man, okay, okay, this is not what I thought it was going to be. This is making me feel a certain way, and but for the most part, people, yeah, they dealt with it very well. They're like, hey, okay, this is what it is. Okay, cool. Hey, I can do it too. I can do it back. Um, so for me, that was interesting to see, right? And I would never interfere with what they're doing and what's going on in their heads. But I've always been a good observer. I've always been good at just watching and learning. Um, I never did it on purpose. I've been doing that since I was a kid. I've never told myself, hey, be quiet and learn. I just was like that.
Mm-hmm. So coming out of having a let's just call it a violent childhood, right? You had, and I mean, we haven't gone into details on how extensive it is, and this is the purpose is not really to make it into like a measurement of mechanical arguments. Rather, I'm really curious on how your mentality was and how you thought about these things, because I think those are the parts that go unspoken, and one of them would be, in this case, PTSD, right? So I saw we had a deployment. My second deployment was a rough deployment for our battalion. We lost three in our company alone, or in our I'm sorry, yeah, in our company, really in our platoon. We lost
2010, right?
what
Well, it was like 2010.
2010. Yep.
Yep.
So yep. So I was a part of the 2010 deployment. That was, it was a busy, hard year, and some of it was blamed on leadership strategies, and some of it was this, that, and the other, and but some people came home from that deployment with something like PTSD, and even at that time, it was still a vague term, kind of a catch-all for you're not doing well and you saw something difficult.
Mm.
At least that's how it was presented. But you came from an environment where this wasn't your first rodeo. This wasn't your first introduction into something like this. And how did you ever have to deal with like kind of bitterness towards people who were complaining about PTSD, whereas
No,
you had no? I'm encouraged by that.
no, because I've seen it. I've seen it as kids. I got brothers and sisters, so I can see some of us dealt with it. We used it as fuel to better ourselves, and some of us are lost, and they're still lost. Um, Same with the gang life and in war. I could see guys be better at it, and I can see guys that were fucked up. But something about PTSD that I don't like is that it's natural. Back then, when I was in the thick of it, I wouldn't have spoken like that, but I understood it. Look, it is natural to go through things in life and experience something and get something from it that might last a day, a week, or your entire lifetime. You can be in a car accident on the freeway and brush it off. Yeah, your back hurts, but there's people who've been in car accidents and they're fucking terrified. I have an aunt who's terrified of going on the freeway. She gets fucking, her palms are sweaty, you know, because she was in a pretty bad freeway accident. And then same with if you're riding a horse and you fall off, some people just don't care. And then some people who fall off are like, I'm never going to be on a horse ever again. Fuck that. And look, that's just life. And to go through war and experience some things and some come back from it, hey man, that is life. It's not your fault. You can't take it. But there's ways to address it. I think there's better ways than others. Obviously, the bottle and pills is not the best way, right? Or not speaking to somebody, being super angry and yelling at your wife or yelling at your kids or hitting your kids or hitting your wife. That's not the best approach. So I always had issues with dudes who wouldn't treat others well when they had issues themselves. And it's like, look, dude, you can't fucking use that as an excuse to be like this. And then that's when I would have problems with them. I would never, it was never like, oh, you know, yeah, I think hopefully I'm making myself clear.
You are. It's a difficult. You are. And maybe if we'll spend a little bit more time on this one. I think we should, because I think we're talking to each other in language that you and I speak to. But this is something that I want that somebody who doesn't have the specific background that you and I have will still has something to gain from it, and still something out there. Because what I experienced when I got out of the military is, you know, I kind of came out of the military sort of warned, because I was getting out in 2013. I knew the idea of getting out of the military and having a sense of aimlessness and purposelessness, this kind of post-military culture shock, was nothing new. And what happened was, when I got out, I thought it was going to be a certain way. I thought I was going to deal with loneliness and isolation and lack of something, and I had a completely different reaction to what I expected, and that was sort of a like an all-consuming depression that was turning into like the inability to make decisions and move and something like that. But then one thing that kind of, I don't want to say if it just scared me a little bit, but it had an impact, was it wasn't unique to veterans. It wasn't unique at all. It's just as I looked out into the world and I saw young men, whether they were graduating from college or and I'm saying specifically to young men, right? And that is men getting out of the military did not have a monopoly on this sort of emptiness. And and what I think PTSD occasionally becomes is it becomes an excuse. Is that there's this lack of sense of community, but there's also this lack of there's this hole in people, and if I can explain it away with PTSD, then I can justify certain activities. And I discovered that wasn't unique to veterans, and how we talk about PTSD, I think, is important to those people, because it helps sort out distractions and remove excuses.
There's PTSD, I think. How can you not have it when you go to war? Obviously, the degree varies upon individual, but some things that I think get put together with PTSD, but like you were saying, you know, other people have it. Is I am a big believer that people, you know, need a community and a sense of purpose, and when they don't have a sense of purpose or a community, they're lost, right? So I think that happens to a lot of veterans, and then they have, with that comes, you know, like, not mental issues, like you have some serious fucking thing going on, but what I'm saying is you're starting to feel and think a certain way, and if you feel and think a certain way for long enough, plus you have lack of sleep and maybe some bad dreams every now and then, or you twitch a lot when you sleep, or you're anxious or anxiety, whatever it is, obviously then it becomes a bigger issue, right? And I came to realize that, look, there's other professions out there that have their PTSD, if you want, that's what you want to use, but like they have their things with it. Being a cop, right? Being a firefighter. I used to think that military and cops were probably the only ones who experienced certain things. And then I had friends who were firefighters, and then they're like, dude, I've had to help pick up dead kids, or nurses or doctors. They're like, another woman died in front of me, or another kid died, or this teenager came in and we tried to help them, and nasty car accident. They were basically done. And when you're in a profession that makes you see these things over and over, you yourself have some type of PTSD, some type of something from it, right? So I've come to learn that, hey, there's other professions out there that experience certain traumas that other people won't have, right? Like a somebody who works at an office is just not going to see those type of things over and over. Um, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly, let's just call it protected situations. Your classic white collar environment might be excluded from the. That's not even the right answer, but I think what I was trying to say is certain people in certain environments, born in their world, never experience what you've experienced, and that's why I kind of wanted to start with where I was at and where I came from. I grew up in a Midwestern small town, and it was just, I mean, sure, the '08 crash completely destroyed the economy there, and people lost lives and businesses and marriages, and the drug of choice was meth, um oddly enough. And so in that environment, that small town, people either went to church or they were into drugs. And then now that I've grown up and grown out, and I've wanted to hear from other people's stories, especially from people who've had different experiences in the world. It's one thing to remember that we're not really alone, and it's another thing to recognize that we have things to learn from each other. And then that, even as that sounds as a bit of a platitude, it's been interesting hearing your story because of how, it's different, man. It's different for us in different cases. I'm not doing a good job describing myself and presenting it right now because I kind of feel like I'm on the edge of where this conversation is going, and that's just an odd place to be.
Well, we all have our stories, right? And back then I couldn't really vocalize it or express it, but one thing that's really helped me is high doses of psychedelics along with therapy, right? Thankfully, my friend Michael Dowd is the one who kept pushing me to do it. So if we would have had this conversation, or I don't even think I would have been able to have this conversation a couple of years ago. And one point about PTSD and people who have PTSD, and during war, look, it's not your fault if you can't handle it. It's not your fault if something's going on. But look, during war, people that are having issues, they're a liability, right? And you can easily express like, hey man, we're doing this war thing, and you're kind of a liability. Or you can just be like, hey, fucking pussy, or whatever, and kick them the fuck out. But the point still stands that in a time of war, you just don't want people like that around you. You don't want people around you that just aren't willing to fucking go all out, right? But back when you're stateside, like, hey man, we're stateside now, and it's okay, and let's work at it, and let's fix these issues. Let's do these things. And I think one of the reasons why I excelled so well in war is because I had what it took to do it, and I knew I had something going on as a warrior when we would go out on missions, and the SF guy who'd been in almost, you know half the time that I've been alive would be like, hey man, Cortez is with me. Or we would go out on dangerous things, and it'd be like, okay, the fucking, this is your, I've been out of the military for not even that long, but I already forget some terms. but here's the list of all the people going out.
Yeah, you're on the roster or something like that. Yeah, I got. Yep, it
Right.
happens.
You're on the roster. Who's on the roster? Well, guess what? Cortez is always on the roster, and Cortez
Absolutely.
is always in the front. And I was not educated Um, I wasn't book smart. Like English was my second language. Okay, um, I graduated. I barely graduated and got my degree. I had no college, so my English wasn't that well. It wasn't that well that when I got out of in the army and started to go to college, I would have to Google certain words that I'm like, I don't know what this means. And then if it took you, let's just say 15 minutes to read a chapter, it probably took me 45 to an hour. I just had to take not just double, but sometimes triple or four times the amount of time to study one subject or a book or for a quiz, whatever than it took for most people. Because even to that point, my English and reading comprehension wasn't that great. Um, but a warrior, I was, and I had what it took, and that itself is something that books can't show you. Theory is just can only take you so far. Training can only take you so far. Doing the real thing is when you come to learn. Like fuck, man. I've been a martial artist since 2011. I've competed in the ring and on the mats, and you can only do so much pad work, so much drilling to help you for a real thing. When you're in the thing, it is so much different. And people who, and I like to use martial arts because one, I mean, I love martial arts. I've been doing it. I've been watching it since I was a kid about Power Rangers, Ninja Turtles, Steven Seagal, or Van Damme movies. You name it, right? Even though Steven Seagal is not a great example to use martial arts, but hey, we didn't know any better, and it was pretty
Oh
entertaining.
no, absolutely. Like it's entertainment, and we know it. Like we're adults here, okay?
Yeah,
Like when I watch a movie like uh The Expendables, like I know it's a movie,
yeah,
okay? And sure, I can laugh at things not being realistic, but it's a movie.
yeah. And but what I'm saying is that the real thing is different, right? Where either you're in a fight in the ring or a fight on the street or a gunfight, it's just different. And I think the community as a whole should, and these we're all alpha males, okay? We get it. Should just pause and be like, hey man, let me listen to these people. Do they know what a fucking what version of a scope this is, or what gen this came out, or who which gun manufacturer is the best? No, they don't really know that stuff. That's not my stuff. That's not my world. But they need to be able to be like, okay, I'm gonna listen to this guy because the thing that I'm training for. If you just want to be a dude who hits steel really fast, really well, then okay, then don't listen to what I'm saying. But if you're trying to prepare yourself for a gunfight, you should probably listen to the dudes who are in there, and then vice versa for the dudes who've been in gunfights. Man, in a lot of ways, I'm a way better shooter now than I was in my time in because people don't understand when you're in, you don't solely focus on shooting, especially if you have another job, right? Like you got to go to demo school. You got to go. I mean, master breacher. You got to go to how to hotwire cars. You have to go do physical stuff. You have to do medical stuff. You have to do, and then if you go to sniper school, then you have to know that stuff. And you have so much to learn, right? Regiment is a prime example of a jack of all trades, a master of none. And so yeah, so there's civilians out there that are way better shooters than some of the dudes in regiment and SF. I mean, yeah, probably, but like we can both learn from each other, and the way we level up as a community is learning from each other. Putting, hey, there's nothing wrong with friendly competition, right? There's nothing wrong with that, but to put things aside and be like, hey, man, as a whole, we need to level up. We can't keep doing the same thing over and over.
Yeah, sometimes it can come across as a childish application of placing one's identity in something that isn't sufficient and holding it. And that's a very wordy way of saying you are not your skill set. You are not your kit. You are not your what you see where I'm going here? Like
Yes.
just because you know how to do a thing doesn't mean that's who you are. You are more than that. You are a summary of your character traits, your memories, your experiences, your skill sets, your stuff. And it's we don't when we try to reduce the identity of ourselves into something like something small,
Yeah.
it doesn't fly. It's not applicable. And well, I mean it's not that it's not applicable. It's just it's insufficient and we know it naturally and it feels empty and we got to figure it out. So I there's one part where I need to make sure we hit to because when you were talking about it being in being in the military, you have a certain issue where somebody is a liability, right? Somebody's a liability to the team, and it's not personal at that point in time. That is one of the advantages that being in the military has, is that if you are focused on the mission, then the sorting of peoples is not personal. In
Correct.
other or at least it's supposed to be, and it betrays it betrays what it should be when it becomes personal. And this is the same thing with law. It's that it's supposed to be functioning a certain way, and when you betray that for personal gains or personal, let's break it down to even a more specific choice. If you've got a guy in the team that can't hack it, and not only can he not hack it, but he's a liability, whether it's because he is so emotionally distraught that he is no longer courageous when he needs to be, or he freezes up and he doesn't perform a skill set, but his buddy is with the officer, and so he's always on every operation, you have a problem there.
100%. And it's not personal. And the right thing should be, hey, people like that should be out of the way, away from us. But unfortunately, that's not how it works. You're right. And even leaders who are like, yo, you shouldn't be in a leadership position, but somebody and you're in. And I think that's why right now the military has a retention problem. I've spoken to friends who are Navy SEALs or just got out, Green Berets, Rangers. So it's not just unit or branch based. It's over the
No.
military. Years and years of the shithead or the kiss ass or whatever, the one who's connected, going up, rank by rank, year after year. Enough people with great experience and great leadership have had enough, and they've said, I'm fucking out. And that's why we are in the situation that we're in.
From your observation, do you think are you seeing more of that problem within, let's just say, within the ranks? And I mean that being like maybe the 04 and below, so like majors and below. Or are you seeing it more from the sort of elites at the top? Because there's
I
definitely.
think
Go
I
ahead.
think I think it's everywhere.
Okay.
Especially people that I've spoken to, it's everywhere. I mean, for fucking God's sake, you have fat camp before the military service. Okay, they don't call it fat camp, but that's what it is. Okay, we're in the business of fighting. Of maybe your job isn't a combat job, but if shit happens, you better be ready to fight. Especially talk to the people in the invasion who were just comms or supply or whatever. They were fucking duking it out too. I know dudes who don't have a combat job who've seen more combat than some special operation guys because guess what? They were part of the fucking invasion and everybody got it. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. No. And there's just kind of this weird. I don't know. I don't want to even call it weird. The comparison game always runs itself aground somewhere, and one of them would be like, okay, so I had more combat experience than a ranger, a guy who served in the Rangers from 2000 or from like 1995 to 2000, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or I had more combat experience than some people in these different positions, right? But a dude who was just an infantry guy in Fallujah saw more combat than I did, for sure. I guaranteed it. If you saw 180 days of constant fighting, you saw more fighting than I did, right? But even that ability to see fighting is kind of like a Purple Heart. Just because you have a Purple Heart doesn't mean that you're a battlefield genius. And so it's an interesting way that we do these comparisons. And for you bringing it down from the inside, I guess that makes it both more clear and less clear, because I've had some conversations too, but on the political scale, it's almost entirely described as, well, the reason why the military is struggling with retention is something amalgamated to Biden plus fear of war of Ukraine plus COVID plus, you know, the increase in programs to make the army more diverse and equitable as opposed to sharp and capable.
Well, I mean, no doubt it might be a reason, but I don't think it's the sole reason. And with people like that, you know what? That's just them entrenched in their ideologies. That's just them. If you say something negative on this side or that side, they take it as a personal attack. Me personally, I don't like either side. I believe that what you accomplish and fail to accomplish on a daily basis has more of an impact than who's in office. I'm not saying whoever's in charge doesn't affect your life, but I think what you do day to day has more of an effect than who's in the office. Because I had success and failures during the Obama administration. And guess what? Obama didn't give me my first success. I did. I worked. I had success and failures during the Trump administration. And guess what? Trump wasn't the reason why I failed at certain things. It was because maybe I didn't prepare enough, or I prepared the wrong way, or whatever. Okay. During the fucking, you name it, man. And this, the world now is just so entrenched in their fucking side. And if you say anything negative, you must be the other side, or you must be this and you must be that. And but I feel like there's a lot of people in the middle who just, again, they're not heard, and it's because of what we spoke about earlier today. Is the negativity is the one that gets the most likes, the most views. So the people who are in the middle are like, hey man, I kind of like stuff on this side and I like stuff on that side, are just not being heard.
So if the I have a bit of a challenge then. Is if the negativity alone is what drives popularity, then why isn't the negative middle the most popular, or are they? And is the sides are the sides just an illusion?
The sides are just, I mean, I think it's old, man. I think you don't have to have a doctors and fucking whatever to know, like, hey, maybe having two sides only who've been running it for years, and it's the same people basically over and over, and then it's probably not the best thing. And in the way it's going, come on, man. I don't think you have to be that smart or that educated to see that just having two sides is my only option is probably not the best thing.
Yeah, mankind has a tendency of polarizing between things, and you see this in subjects, and you see this in communities. I mean, there's it's not. I wish I could say it was unusual that we have such a polarized red and blue, left and right, but that's like that is what humanity does. Is it tends to exacerbate and exaggerate polarities.
I uh, the other day I was thinking, like, man, how can this happen? I hate what's happening. And then I come to realize, you know what? We deserve this. We deserve this because as a whole, or as certain sides have allowed this to happen little by little, and then now we are at where we're at because our failures of the things that we failed to do as people. And we deserve this. We deserve, as much as it's fucking terrible, think about it. So many of us have said that this is not my problem. Someone else is going to do it. I will not set the example no matter what. And because they said this, I can say that, or they did this and I can do that. And we are here because our own fucking fault.
It's refreshing to hear you say that, especially in the way that you brought. I'm gonna I'm gonna say this way. I've heard something like that said before, particularly with a certain bend, and that is not bend, but from a certain perspective. And I believe both can be true at the same time. But this one is, you hear it from a certain, like, some of the Christian communities, like, oh, if we don't get if the nation is getting what it deserves, or maybe we're the bad guys, or you hear this kind of sentiment over and over and over again of, our country is getting what it deserves because we've allowed decadence to ruin our stance on morals, or because of all of these different, some of them are very politically driven, some of them are very socially driven, some of them are driven in different ways. And so I'm not trying to like flatten the arena and say all are the same, but I think you're right in the sense of, as long as we continue to abdicate our responsibility to our community, we are going to continue to get the outcome that we deserve. And the outcome that we will deserve is a community that doesn't have any foundation.
Yeah, and I understand what you're saying, and from just to clarify for the listeners of again, I am, if you listen to what I've been saying, what from day one as a child and teenager in the military and even out now I've always been good at just observing, not necessarily picking a side, and just trying to learn, trying to be better. And my observation, right, is we deserve this because as failures, the things you have to accomplish certain things and you have to be a cup half full type of guy to fucking make it out of the environment that I was in, right? You have to. You can't be negative. You can't be a negative Nancy, and you can't not execute, or you will never get out. And I got out. So when I see the country that I love in this situation, me based off someone who's always been based off action and taking responsibility, we are here as a whole because we have failed. And now we have certain groups taking action. What will that look like in the future? I don't know, but I want this country to succeed. I want more people who are true leaders to look, man. I've heard and had conversations with great people who are like, yeah, dude, you're a great leader. You're a great individual, and you should probably be leading. But they don't want to lead because they're like, fuck that, I don't want that job, you know. But I think it's time that those people who've said, hey, I don't want this job, to just be like, fuck, man, I didn't want it. I don't want to get into politics. I don't want to do anything, and I have to do it because look at where we're at. You know, '08 election, I was 18, so I can actually vote. I didn't vote because I remember thinking like, dude, I'm about to go to war. You know, I don't care about anything else but just learn my job, do my part, not be a liability, get all my dudes back, right? I mean, they weren't my dudes, but you know what I mean, like the people with me. But I do remember thinking like, hey, who's running? And then Obama was running, and I was like, oh shit, man, not that long ago, African Americans were slaves, and then now we got one running as president. Like, yo, this is the best country. This is the best country in the world. And then the next election, again, I was like, this time I'm a team leader. I'm like, oh shit, like I don't really care. I'm not gonna vote. And I didn't even know who the hell was running. 2016 is right when I got out. So I was ready. So I'm like, you know what? Maybe it is time for me to vote. I'm not going to war. I'm not leading soldiers of war. Maybe it's my time to just do my civil duty and see who's the best side. But I remember looking at both options and been like, look, man, I've spent almost a decade in the military. I've seen and been surrounded by great leadership, not just leadership, but also peers. And I'm not talking about the ability to just lead men at war, but the ability to be a great leader in and out of uniform, have some common sense, have understanding, compassion, morals. And I've been around high calibers of service members and individuals. And when I look at the list of who was your options, I'm like, yo, this is not the best the country has to offer. It is not. But unfortunately, the system, this is the best that the system has to offer. And how did we get here? And we got here because of us. Because as people, as wholes, we failed to do a lot of things. I don't even know where I was going with this. I just felt like I had it.
No, I think it's on time. I think it's on point because I'm not just going to agree with you because you're a guest, and that's an important. As a host, I think that's an important thing that gets missed a little bit, because I certainly have my political positions, right? However, as I'm listening to you talk about, well, we get what we've got, we've kind of received what we've deserved, and one of the ways that I've seen that play out is the savior complex. This idea that someone's going to come in and somebody over there in Washington is going to get into presidency and change the world, and then we'll have eudaimonia and utopia for 4 more years, and it's never the case. And it is, so long as we predicate our political positions on having somebody in some office save us, I think we're going to continue to experience this pain. But we're also seeing a reaction to that, and that I think is the homesteading environment, where so many people are sort of focusing closer on what they have control over, what they have responsibility over, and then allowing that to expand from the inside out, as opposed to a top-down approach.
I agree, and even though I've been saying all this stuff that this is what we deserve, this is what we get, you got to understand. I'm always and always be a positive guy, right? So I think what's one thing that's gonna hopefully save us, and I feel well, is the internet. It's the ability to connect with people a lot easier. People having these conversations, people showing, documenting who they are, the work that they do, and see that the people that hey, there's people out there that are great leaders that can do things and organize a lot faster, a lot easier, right? And get the word around. And I think that in its own is the one thing that's really different compared to the 90s, the 80s, the 70s, 60s, 50s, where you didn't have this tool, right? It might just seem something as simple that's it's on your phone, it's on your laptop, it's on your iPad. Who fucking cares? No, this is a powerful tool. And I think that if we use it properly, uh, maybe not us, but our kids can see a dramatic shift because people need to understand that things move slow. Things have always moved slow. There are some events that change things really fast, but as a whole, things move slow.
They yeah, there's when you when we try to talk about the movement and the progress of humanity, or whatever the word you want to do, how things change through time in humanity, like it's extremely difficult, because what is your unit of measurement is becomes a problem. It's like it's it's not something that we don't notice. It's just something that we can't measure the same way. I mean, you can look at processor speed or processing power for computers, and they're like, okay, we can measure that. But if you look at progress, and this is a challenge with the idea of progress, is that like there is no unit of measurement. There's no distinct way. Now we can look at certain things that we want to see. Maybe in certain camps, it might be the diversity of boards according to racial makeup in the United States, and it's like, well, that's one metric, but it is its own, right? And it has consequences. However, I think that I don't know if that conversation goes anywhere as much anymore. I think what we're seeing for people, and what I think I've been listening to you and some of the stuff you've talked about with either with Andy Stumpf and a couple of other shows, is I'm also curious on what you are working on now. Like, where are you at and what are you doing? Because you stopped going to school, which is is not an unusual story, because you found something that was working really well for you.
Yeah.
What are you up to these days, and where are you seeing the community go? Because I asked this question not too long ago, and I want to hear your answer. Is we've done a really decent job describing how gun culture has evolved over the last 20 years. But
Yeah.
now we're at that chapter where we're sitting and we're looking forward, saying, where do we want it to go next? And I want to open up that conversation to very publicly.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So some of the things that I'm doing now, okay, and what's helped me is the people I've surrounded myself with, and the work that I put in. A lot of the work that has not necessarily given me any money, but it's work that needs to be done within the community, um, and in the gun community. First, the gun community needs to level up, and I feel like we are demonstrating that. The company Defense Strategies Group is demonstrating that. And to simplify it, is the fact that, look, gear is very important, experience is very important, but you can't rely on past accomplishments or your Gucci gear to save you in the future. You have to be current. You have to be the best version of yourself that possibly can be. I understand we have disabilities or injuries that prevent us from doing certain things, but we need to do the best with what we have. The gun community is great about Gucci gear, but they are terrible at at addressing flexibility, mobility, conditioning, strength, and practical use. So we as a company are showing that we are not perfect. Just sooner or later, you're going to see a mistake. I don't know anyone who's perfect. I don't know anyone who speaks properly 24/7 or executes drills and never misses or whatever. But I feel like we are one of the companies out there showing that our instructors are all active in the martial arts community. We compete, we train, because um, you're more likely to be in a physical altercation than a gunfight. Um, and then when you're are in a gunfight, there's certain things that are realistic and some, it's great to train with the belt and all that. But I don't know about you, but I don't walk around with my belt. I don't walk around with my holster and my whole fucking kit. Um, and I don't wear combat boots and combat stuff. So we as a community, as a company, are by action. You can see it on social media, but more importantly, you can see it in person. Um, we're based in California, and we have some big project coming up that we've already done that haven't been published yet. That I think will put the company out there, and I think what is one big thing a factor that is different between everyone else in these companies is that I have friends in other companies, but we are actually trying to build a community, and not actually, we are building a community. You can see it. You can see it through people speaking. You can changing people's lives. We would do certain events, and at the end, these people are different, and they're changing their life, and they're doing something different. And the company that we haven't spoken about, but my company, OG Pumpkin. Well, OG Pumpkin, we saw rash guards, we saw T-shirts, we saw all that, but the company started first because I was hosting events and in my house, and then I kept. And then my wife told me like, "Hey, we're about to have our third kid. We keep going negative into our account. We barely make rent. I know these events mean a lot to you and the veterans, but like we gotta stop doing this." So I started OG Pumpkin. Um, and first it was just stickers and T-shirts, and now rash guards. Um, and it's grown to the point where we have almost 700 people with an OG Pumpkin tattoo on them. We have hosted events. I started off with just mentoring and sponsoring college kids and high school kids who wanted to join the special operations community. I'm almost at 30 young men who've joined the special operations community that I've helped sponsor. Because like, hey, when you're a high schooler and you're trying to train for selection and you need a rucksack and you need boots, well, hey man, some people are well off, right? But some people are not. And hey, a rucksack and boots, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money these kids don't have. And we would sponsor that. And then I sponsor fighters, some UFC fighters, skaters, jiu-jitsu practitioners, and we would host events, right? Some are skateboarding events. Last summer, I gave away a little over $6,000 worth of skateboards all over Southern California. So I've been doing first the events at my house. Then, because I started OG Pumpkin and been on some of these big podcasts, the company has grown. I've done more community work, but what a big thing that's been happening is people who used to be at Hurley reached out. And they were at Hurley in the beginning days, and they've reached out and they've been mentoring me. People from tribal streetwear have been mentoring me, and it's not it's the goal is to make it even bigger than what it is now. And I'm working on. I haven't picked a location, but I will have a headquarters somewhere where people can physically come. Not necessarily just a store, bigger than just a store. It's not just going to be a store. So that's what's next, and obviously having people who used to be at Hurley and tribal and people who are tribal helping me out and guide me obviously is a big help. So that's kind of where I'm at. That's the two things that I'm focusing on when it becomes not family, right? But family is always on top of my list. A lot of people, if they see my videos or pictures, my kids are there, whether it's at the martial arts gym or it's at sometimes even at the range, or at the events. If you've been to OG Pumpkin events, you've seen my kids, you've seen my family. I don't separate either, because I've done enough of that when I was in the military.
So what does community building mean to you? What does it look like, and what does it mean to you? And what is it like inviting people into your home?
So what it looks like from the beginning is I would buy the UFC card and food, and I would tell veterans from my school at the time, it was Cal State Long Beach, and my martial arts gym, and I would be like, hey, first it started off as veterans, right? I would be like, hey man, let's just come and let's just watch the fights. But the fights were just an excuse for other dudes to get together and just talk, right? I would even tell veterans like, hey man, you don't even have to be into the UFC. You don't even have to be into martial arts or even do it. It's like just come and hang out. And sometimes it would just be like 4 people. And then it grew to like 10, 20. And then sometimes when I have the UFC fights at my house, I got 65 people here, right? And some of them they're not even paying attention to the fights, but they just come to hang out. And then I started doing skateboarding events because I skate, right? I surf, I do martial arts, and my first skate event was at my house. I had a couple $100 to give away because of sales, and I told amateur skaters like this is an amateur event only, $500 for the best run on the mini ramp. 65 people showed up, and then I teamed up with other people, and the second skate event we had over 400 people show up. We turned a warehouse into a skate park. And then the year after that, we had over 800 people show up. So that's what that looks like to me. Community building looks at trying to gather people wherever, for whatever, just to have a good time. People have come to my house and then they're like, damn, dude, I thought you lived in a house. I didn't know you lived in an apartment. I live in a 3-bedroom apartment. And people and I was like, what do you mean? They're like, well, because you're always giving stuff away. So I thought you were already established and had like a house, and then you just decided to do more. And I'm like, no, man, I grew up poor. Like a 3-bedroom apartment is all I need. I don't need anything else. During COVID, I went on the Fieldcraft podcast, and in my house, it's always been anything past rice and beans is extra. So I would literally put $400 on Target gift cards, scratch off the back, and put it on OG Pumpkin's Instagram and be like, hey man, if you lost your job or you need things for your kids or the elderly, here's $400. And I would do that over and over. I would drop off hundreds of dollars at food banks that as a kid I used to be in line. Now I'm not in line. Now I'm dropping off food and school supplies. And do events. Some of my most famous events I call it vehicles and tacos. I buy vehicles and invite veterans and law enforcement, and we shoot to and from the vehicles. I have a taco guy come out. I have a band or a banda for Spanish music, come out and play, and we make a whole fucking thing out of it. And those events sometimes range, depending on how much I'm trying to give into it, range from $5,000 to $10,000. I've done about 8 of those. I finally did taxes, and as you can imagine, I got a bunch of penalties because I didn't do taxes for the last 3 years. But on paper, I finally saw that I gave away over $200,000 in the last 3 years back to the community. There's enough hours of me speaking to understand that I've always just wanted a place that I belong and a purpose. I found that. So anything past that is just extra. Like, look, man, I've tried to spend money on myself. I've tried. It does nothing for me. If you're into Gucci, Jordans, expensive ass, whatever, okay, cool, man. You're not necessarily a bad person, but like that does nothing to me. I have had all this money and I wear Vans, and I wear Vans until they have so many fucking holes because I skate. And then I start buying another pair when I have holes in my socks because the holes from the shoes and flipping the board have now caused holes in my socks. The things that interest me are martial arts and skating, and they're not really expensive things. I don't go out at night. So that's what, long story short, that is what community looks like. This is why I have almost 700 people with an OG Pumpkin tattooed on them, because they hear the story, they believe in it. It's not just some company that decided to just put a fucking gun on it or a skull and just start selling. There's nothing wrong with that. I like companies that do that. But from day one, this was just to build community. That's why if you go on the Instagram page, from day one, I put constant progression, community building, because that's always it's been. It's been since day one.
Yeah, that's a very good change. That's consistent. It's not consistent. It's indicative of our culture right now, and I'm okay with it. I think I'm glad that you're here and you're a leader in that in component. If that doesn't come across incorrectly, like it's your story is a good thing because that's exactly where people are at. When I got out of the military and I recognized that I wasn't the only person alone, I wasn't the only person in that like kind of lack of sense of community. That was a big shift for me, and it's been years, but we've seen that change now, where there is more of this drive towards being involved with one another and trying to figure out who we are. And one of the ways that I want to see that change is, or see that change in the near future, is this mentality of how we approach not only training but community events as far as training in that sense. Is that how do we get more out there for more people? Uh, how do we get more access? Not, it's just not more access, but just more time together on the range. Like I'll go to the range with you and we'll shoot, but we're also getting to know each other. It's and half of what we accomplish at the range, maybe 3/4 of what we accomplish at the range together, is oftentimes followed up with or accomplished as well by inviting you over for dinner. So, if you're ever in my neck of the woods, consider that an open door invitation to sit down at the dinner table. My family and I love to cook, and that's one thing. But I need to change the topic one more time, and and it was something that you said earlier, and you were talking about how you get out of the military now, and you don't have to give it. You don't have to give. It's not that you said you don't have to give it your all or 100%, but there was something that you said about intensity that I don't know. It's like I'm curious if you can elaborate on it, because I'm not describing it well. So let me put it back together. Is that we were talking about guys who you got out of in the military, you were 100% intense all the time. You had this intensity towards getting the mission done, whatever, and that intensity came out in personality. It came out in decisions that you made. And then now that you're not in the military, you don't have that we try to solve the personal problems, our internal struggles, the same way that we solved our external struggles. And do you have anything? Like? Does that make? Am I talking about something that makes sense to you?
Yeah. So I know people, and because we're in SoCal, and we've done a lot of work and with Hollywood, National Geographic, and stuff like that. And the running a theme, whether people realize what's happening, is to be really good at your job, at whatever it is, whether it's something that you do for National Geographic, or you're a comedian, or you're a rapper, or you name it. You have to spend a lot of time doing that. But if you have a family, I know we're doing it, especially if you're a service member, you're doing it, or you're a cop, you're trying to do it for your family, but you're not there. You're not present, and it suffers. Your kids suffer, your family suffer, your marriage suffers. Come on, what is the divorce rate for law enforcement, military, or just people in general? So I don't want to ignore my family. I don't think you have to. I'm pretty sure there's a lot of dudes, and I've seen it in the gun community, who are great shooters, to spend a lot of time at the range, spend a lot of time with their buddies and doing that, but they're dads. And if you're at the range all the time, and if you're training all the time, don't fucking play it off that you're having great quality time, long time with your kids and wife, because that's not happening. Because I've seen it in the military.
Yeah, I think and I think I know it. It's easy to be distracted, because if let's just say my business, right, or this podcast, or my community building efforts, or the exchange from being committed to the boys, and I'm in the military, and I'm driving to do everything for this deployment. The deployment is the healthy distraction.
Yeah.
It eventually becomes an unhealthy distraction. Like the nice thing about war is it sorts out what is important really, really fucking fast.
Oh yeah.
And it sorts it out really, really, really quickly. Suddenly those trivial little arguments don't matter. However, the inverse is true, in the sense that things left untended tend to get out of hand. That's not even the right way of saying it. Your relationship, your marriage left alone, neglected, eventually comes back to haunt you.
100.
And
And I think in the gun community, we need also that. I've seen dudes where I'm like, look, man, being a gunfighter is fucking, or this thing that you want. Okay, you may not understand it, but there's some importance to it. But we're also dads.
yeah, you know what I've seen lately, and I don't know if it's just some form of like depression or whatever, is that I've noticed that the divorce rate amongst social media personalities in our sphere is pretty damn high. And not only that, it's not just veterans. Like you can't just say it's the military anymore. And that's kind of an interesting. I don't know if I haven't quantified it yet, but I've been seeing it happen of like, oh, this guy, he's got a big, he's built a big channel that helps drive young men towards excellence, or this guy has, and it's like, well, he's done the same thing. He's done the same thing. These guys, and we're finding these stories kind of build up where our successes as a community, I'm just going to not democratize it, but I'm going to socialize it, I guess. Our successes are good. Like we have good things that we're seeing. We're seeing so much more unity amongst the community. As much as people want to say to the opposite, they're just wrong. Gun culture is so much more mature. It's so much more active. It's so much more community led and community focused. It's also where our skill sets, our training, our kit, and our mentality has matured. And I've been around a long enough time to say that I'm confident in that. I'm quite confident that we've matured away from silly conversations like 9mm versus 45 or competition shooting versus tactical shooting. Like none of that shit matters. You're missing the point. You're dating yourself outside of the pool. But I'm seeing this issue of like, are we actually looking after our families? Are we just saying it? Are we calling for what we should do but not doing it? Are we neglecting our families?
And I've seen it. I've seen it. So because I've seen it, I know that it is happening. There's a lot of people that preach family this, or they'll post a picture of that, and then I know, and I'm like, bro, you don't spend that much time, quality time, with your kids. And it took high doses of psychedelics for me to understand that I failed doing that during my military career. But yeah, my phone's probably about to die. I don't have a charger on me right now.
No, we're right at that time limit, so it looks like we have to have a follow-on conversation, but let's call it good for today.
Okay.
So where do people find you on social media, and where are your effort? Like if you're putting efforts in projects, where do people find those right now?
Yeah, it's OG Pumpkin. You can literally Google that and it'll come up. The Instagram is _OG_pumpkin. My personal one is Angel G Cortes with an S 175. And yeah, I train at Classic Fighting, Raw Talent Boxing. So if you're in the area, you're looking for martial arts or just to train for a day or come by, but you have your own gym and you want to do some cross training, come, because I'm there all the time. If it's for my kids, for my own training, or to help teach the kids class, come over. Come to an OG Pumpkin event whenever. Sometimes it's shooting base or skateboarding, or sometimes it's just surfing or whatever, but just come out. We're not going anywhere. This is something I've always been doing and I'm very passionate about. And thank you again for having me on.
Angel, it's been a pleasure. And one of the things that I want to thank you for is that despite all the ways that we try to work through these difficult conversations, I think you are a genuine encouragement to this culture. So thank you for what you're doing. I've seen a little bit. I've seen small pieces of your influence, and I, as a host of a show, am edified. I'm thankful for it. So keep going, man. It's really good to see.
All right, man. Well, thank you. Have a good day, man.
All right, cool. Well, let's wrap it up. And for those who are still listening, this has been the Redacted Culture Cast. These are the kind of conversations that we want to have here. We want to talk about what we believe to be right and true and good, and what we focus on as a gun community going forward. So if you want to support the show, you can head over to redactedculture.locals.com and join the community, or you can check out our merch at redactedllc.com, our store, whatever we've got cooked up there, whether it's t-shirts, stickers, and merch in that sense, or your little reminder that our property without privacy is going to be pointless. So That being said, carry on.